All right. All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Anybody ever have that little piece of hair that decides that it does not want to lay down? That's me today. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Lady Dreamer. Good morning, Lady Barbara. Good morning, Prophet Jonathan. Good morning, Lady Dawn. Good morning, Lady Judy. I hope everybody is having a great and wonderful day. I am in my office and we're going to try to make this work. I usually don't like to be up here when I'm doing this. As you can see, I don't have anything on the wall. All my stuff on the wall is over there. So it is a beautiful day outside, which is distracting me. I'm looking out the window at this water and trees, and it just looks wonderfully peaceful. And I'm gonna go enjoy that during my walk today. So I want to say good morning to everyone, and I want to thank you for your patience. Yesterday was a day I pray that I never live ever again. Through the fault of no one but my own, I left my phones in another state. So, yeah, quite an adventure. Had to retrieve my phones. First of all, I had to suspend them to make sure nobody tried to use them. If they would have found them, they would have been useless to them. Then I had to retrieve my phone, so that was 5 hours on the road yesterday. Good morning, Lady Ravonda. And then I had to reactivate my phones and get them back working. So, needless to say, I really couldn't contact anybody on yesterday except for my husband. So I am back in business. Thank God. God is a keeper of that which belongs to us. Um, and so I have both my phones back. Neither one of them has been hacked. Everything, all is well in my world once again. But let's just say it's one of those things that you pray never, ever, ever happens to you. All right, because it was time consuming, it was frustrating, it was all of those things. But thank you all for your patience with me. And I said to myself, after preaching the divine word of God, we can still right afterwards do very human things that lets us know and reminds us that we are still human. So today is Teachable Tuesday, and we are looking at Stamped from the Beginning, the definitive history of racist ideas in America. As we have been learning and watching things go down in our country literally in real time, some of you have actually been paying pretty good attention to what we've been reading and seeing how it literally is correlating to what's happening in real time. And we're going to be reading from a Black History Reader. A Black History Reader. We're going to look at another one of Dr. Claude Anderson's questions. And I think I'm going to go with question number 10 today because I keep hearing people try to assert this with black people. And I want to make sure that we understand so we can give an answer for this question. And that question is, what is racism? And can a black person be a racist? All right. I still see black people saying that we can be racist. That tells me that you don't understand what racism is. And I hate to sound like I'm fussing today, but I need us, all right, to stop taking on terms and definitions of ourselves that have been foisted upon us in order to divert the attention from what is really going on in this country. And lastly, well, actually, firstly, I think I said I was going to begin with immigration today. We're going to continue. Correct. Thank you, Pastor Ben. We're going to continue. This land is our land. We are almost done with learning about immigration, and we are on the chapter that talks about immigration into the 21st century. So that's where we are now. We're talking about how race and employment were still two big fears about immigrants coming over into the United States. So that's where we're going to start today. And I want to show you some images. I want to show you this image of President Lyndon Johnson. That's where we're going to start today. Signing the 1965 Immigration Reform Bill into law. You see that? All right. He's signing it into law, and you see who's next to him. Does anybody recognize Bobby Kennedy, who's in the crowd there? Dr. Michael Eric Dyson recently put out a book about his meeting with black entertainers, actors, etc. And his book is called What the Truth Sounds Like. And it was all of these people, including James Baldwin, that met with him and really laid into Bobby Kennedy about what needed to change in our country. And so his book is about that little known conversation. So let's continue this talk about immigration in the 20th century, because it is right along with what is happening right now. We're going to be back. I just want to remind you that we are going to be back tonight because I do want to make up for yesterday. So we'll be back tonight at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you can join us, please join us. We're going to be covering our motivation section, and we're going to be talking about the book 11. And we're going to be talking about having that Nathan in your life. That's where we're going to be. All right. So if you want to join us for that conversation tonight at 6 p.m., please do so. Race and employment were still big fears. To pass the law, supporters had to convince Americans that it would not change the ethnic character of the United States or overwhelm America with immigrants. Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts predicted the law will not flood our cities with immigrants. It will not upset the ethnic mix of society. It will not cause American workers to lose their jobs. Clearly, these sentiments are still being expressed today, and many people have come to recognize that American workers are not losing their jobs. They're losing the jobs that no Americans want to do. All right? Those were the jobs that immigrants were taking when they came over. They were taking the jobs that most Americans did not want to do, such as be out in the hot sun picking berries, be out in the hot sun pulling bugs off of lettuce and putting it in boxes. All right? If you saw some of the articles that began to come out late last year and into this year, all right, the people in California and other places that rely upon immigrant workers, right, to bring in the harvest, so to speak, they're already complaining that their food is rotting in the fields because they don't have the number of workers that they need, all right? And so it was not immigrants that were displacing the quote unquote jobs that Americans wanted. It is obvious that the great days of immigration have long since run their course said Sidney Yates, a congressman from Illinois, who believed that millions of people would no longer come to this country. Were they right? In the 1950s, there were about 250,000 legal immigrants a year to this country. Within 40 years, there would be more than 4 times as many coming to the United States. Just as in the past, immigrants were looking for ways to make a living and improve their children's lives in a world that is often politically and economically unstable. By the 1980s, more than 80% of documented immigrants came from Asia and Latin America. It is impossible to tell how many undocumented immigrants come, not only from Latin America, but from all over the world. Europeans, Canadians, Asians, and others stay on after their visitor or tourist visas expire. One estimate puts the number of illegal immigrants at 12 million people between 2000 and 2010. The number of African immigrants grew after the 1965 immigration law passed. Tunde Ayobami came here from Nigeria when he was 21 in 1969. At first, he lived in Rhode Island. I was the first Nigerian in the area, he said. Before I came here, none of us had the idea of going to the suburbs. But I tell them this place is really peaceful. I try to find jobs for them and find school at the same time. Ayobami got a degree in medical technology. He wanted to sell technical equipment. Most people didn't think I could make it. First, because of my Nigerian accent, they said I would never sell to anybody. But he got the job. Since I've been on the road, he said, my territory has been improved about 200%. He has encountered prejudice in the United States, but he explained, I became understanding. People are this way. They're not going to change. I'm going to change. So I became tolerant. Immigrants also came from the Middle East. Murat Suku immigrated from Turkey in 1985. He was already a medical doctor and received a visa for physician training. I spoke good English, but I did not know many of the standardized ways of doing things in U.S. hospitals. I was working 12, 14-hour days, he said. Because his visa was a temporary one, to stay in the United States permanently, Dr. Suku had to work in a part of the country that did not have enough doctors. He worked at a Veterans Administration hospital in Pittsburgh and received his green card. Remember what I said about it is not good to compare the immigrants that are coming over with the descendants of the enslaved. Because, as you just heard, they're not bringing people over that are poor to this country. If they're taking immigrants, they're usually taking immigrants who already have education, who already have a level of upward mobility so that they can easily assimilate into American society. All right? Now he is a noted cardiologist and teacher at Cleveland Clinic in Ohio. I feel as much a part of this country as I do a part of Turkey, he said. I don't think that I have to choose to be Turkish or an American. I really think that I can be both. The path to legal immigration keeps changing, as do the laws. Can I say that one more time? Because a lot of my white brothers and sisters, okay, they like to say, well, the law is the law. No. The law can change, and the law, good morning, and the law can be whatever our country decides it can be. All right? And so the path to legal immigration keeps changing, as do the laws, because, all right, immigration has always been tied to race and ethnicity, all right, and controlling the number of certain ethnicities within the United States. The American economy suffered recessions beginning in 1975, raising fears once again that immigrants would take jobs from American citizens. In 1978, Congress created the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy to come up with solutions. Father Theodore Hesburgh, who had been president of Notre Dame University, headed the commission. Father Hesburgh wrote in the New York Times in 1986, during the next 15 years, assuming a persistently strong economy, the United States will create about 30 million new jobs. Can we afford to set aside more than 20% of them for foreign workers? No. It would be a disservice to our own poor and unfortunate. But the commission did propose that undocumented immigrants who had been in the United States for a long time be granted legal status. It also recommended stricter border patrols to keep new people out. The two recommendations were meant to balance each other by controlling immigration growth. The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, followed these suggestions. It allowed long-time undocumented immigrants to apply to be legal residents and eventually citizens. It increased the number of border patrols. It also set penalties for Americans who knowingly hired illegal immigrants. But fining American employers was a controversial provision and difficult to enforce without seeming to violate Americans' rights. Although border security increased, undocumented Mexicans and others continued to cross into the United States, and they found other routes to get here. By 1998, an estimated 2.68 million illegal immigrants had become permanent residents. This was 88% of all those who had applied. In 1990, the Immigration and Nationality Act allowed a total of 700,000 immigrants to come to the United States each year. The easiest way to enter was as the family member of someone who was already here. The law also allowed more people to immigrate for work. Gali Ramnath, an Asian American who lived in Trinidad, was 41 when she came to the United States in 1998. For 5 years, she worked as a live-in babysitter in Connecticut under a visa that made her return to Trinidad every 6 months. In 2002, she started studying for a high school degree. In my culture, the girls were not pushed for an education, she said. You're pushed really to take care of the house and your family, and that's it. You know how to read and write, but you have to cook, clean the house, learn to sew, and take care of your husband and children. I came to America to find a better life, but I realized that to have a good life here, you need to be educated or else you're stuck in a menial job. She graduated from Brooklyn College in 2009. She was 52 years old. You cannot give in to the stumbling blocks that will come into your life. People say this country is the land flowing with milk and honey, but you don't see that milk and honey until you start to work for it. Many immigrant stories start with difficulty, involve hard work, and end with success. This is as true now as it was for the first European colonists. And while that is wonderful, and while that is lovely, and while that is all true, somebody says, what's the simplest way to differentiate between someone who grew up in the United States, who's a descendant of a slave, and someone who's an immigrant coming to this country? They just explained it to you. Difficulty, hard work, and ending with success. In other words, they do not have the history that black Americans in this country have of continual enslavement, oppression, and suppression on your way to hard work and success. All right? So that's what makes the difference. They don't have the history that the descendants of the enslaved have. All right? Jim Crow was not for them. Okay. Jim Crow was not for them. Peonage was not for them. All right? But guess who benefited from the civil rights movement? Everybody. Kirill Tarpov immigrated from Bulgaria in 2000. I received an invitation from the Bulgarian Eastern Orthodox Church based in New York to become their music conductor, and they offered me a work visa. I came here to have a future as a musician, and second, to give a chance to my adopted son because he has dark skin. His parents were Egyptian, and back in Bulgaria, we have a lot of problems with people with dark skin color. Because that's not just an American problem. He found, keyword, less racism in the United States. To make more money, Tarpov took a job at a coffee shop. I didn't speak any English, but I was working with the customers, and it's amazing how kind they were. They took their time to explain things to me, what things meant, like bagel with cream cheese. Some of them came just to help me and teach me. That's why I respect and love New Yorkers. The support of Americans has been essential to enabling immigrants to assimilate and thrive. Church groups and pro immigrant organizations often help individual immigrants or generally fight for immigrant rights. Kirill Tarpov came legally to the United States. Carlos Escobar came illegally from Mexico in 1996. I had been a construction worker, but the company I worked for closed. I wanted my son to have a good education and maybe one day go to college, which was never a possibility for me. When I was little, I sold food on the street so my family could eat. He paid a coyote $3,000 to get him across the U.S. border. A coyote is the people that help carry people across illegally, in case you didn't know. At one point, we didn't have a drink of water for nearly 2 days. There were lots of rattlesnakes, scorpions, heat, and dust. I could see the lights of the American Border Patrol. The coyote told us that many like us did not make it. But Escobar succeeded. He worked long days in a vineyard in Northern California. He studied English in a class held in the basement of a church at night. With help from his English teacher, he was finally able to get a green card. After 7 years, brought his wife and son to the United States. This was the greatest day of my life, he said. Eventually, he became an American citizen. His son went to college. He wants to be a lawyer who helps other immigrants. Should immigrants who enter without documents like Carlos Escobar be allowed to get green cards or become U.S. citizens? This is one of the biggest issues in the debate about immigration today. Some Americans think it would be sensible and fair, especially if they have lived here for years, worked, and paid taxes. Others think it would be rewarding people who broke the law. They see illegal immigrants as criminal. The one thing all Americans seem to agree on is that we have to reform our immigration laws, but they cannot agree on how to reform them. Republicans in Congress and state offices tend to favor no amnesty for illegals and stricter controls for entry. Amnesty means the United States would ignore the fact that immigrants came without documents and provide a path to stay permanently or become citizens. Democrats often support amnesty and would allow larger numbers of immigrants in, but they also want to strengthen controls. Politics plays an important role in their attitudes. Legal immigrants who become citizens are voters, and politicians and lawmakers don't want to lose their votes. But they don't want to lose the anti immigrant vote either. The American public seems to be as divided as the government on what should happen about immigration law reform. As of mid 2015, no comprehensive immigration reform law had been passed, which is why here we are, 2018, and people are still arguing over what is happening. And now, because we have a severely anti immigrant administration altogether, now you are seeing the implementation of cruelty along with no resolutions. It takes a lot of paperwork and a lot of time, often years, to process legal immigration applicants. Pro immigration Americans argue that there would be fewer illegal immigrants, if it were easier to apply for the needed documents. They want to simplify the process. Americans both for and against increased immigration seem to agree that the United States should welcome immigrants to fill jobs that require special education and training. And many employers want workers to fill unskilled jobs. But are there enough American workers already who can fill these jobs? Some people argue that Americans are not willing to do low-paying jobs, and I'm going to say that tends to be true. They're not willing, many of them who are complaining, like cleaning and janitorial work that immigrants are willing to do. Perhaps the most newsworthy question is, how can we keep immigrants from crossing illegally over the border with Mexico? In 2010, 58% of undocumented immigrants were Mexican, about 6.5 million people, and 23% came through Mexico from other parts of Latin America. About 11%, 1.3 million of undocumented immigrants were from Asia, 4% from Europe and Canada, 3% from Africa and other countries. Illegal immigrants crossed the border with Canada as well. In 2010, nearly 7,500 people were caught trying to cross from Canada. The countries they came from included Albania, the Czech Republic, Israel, and India. Many crossed by boat or jet ski, or by swimming to states like Michigan, New York, and Minnesota. In 2011, more suspected terrorists were caught trying to enter the United States through Canada than through Mexico, according to the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency. Yet, most Americans are far more concerned with undocumented Latin American immigrants than with those from other countries. Some Americans have been concerned that illegal immigrants and their children receive government and health and social services and free public education. American citizens pay for these benefits through taxes, but illegal immigrants also pay taxes. They pay sales tax, they pay gasoline and property tax, and studies show they also pay federal and state income tax and Social Security tax. Yet in 1994, Californians voted in favor of Proposition 187, which said that illegal immigrants could not have these benefits of being an American citizen. California then withdrew the law in 1999. The 1996 platform of the Republican Party included these words, quote, "We support a constitutional amendment declaring that children born in the United States of parents who are not legally present in the United States or who are not long-term residents are not automatically citizens." In 1996, Congress passed a law reducing the number of public benefits to legal immigrants if they were not citizens of the United States. All right, so we're going to stop there for today. We've got a few more pages to go, but I believe we're going to finish this, or I will make it my business to finish it in an extended Daring Dialogues. All right, but I want to show you this last photograph. This photo shows part of the fence that separates the United States and Mexico, built when Congress passed the Secure Fence Act in 2006. The fence has not been completed. All right, so there is that fence. All right, and recently I was looking at a short documentary about how the United States funded Mexico to secure their southern border, all right, which was supposed to help stop the flow of, I think, Guatemalans, El Salvador's, and I can't remember the third group of people from coming into Mexico's southern border to come up through Mexico and then into the United States. And they said because of the United States helping to secure their Mexico's southern border, it is now creating the problems that we see now, because a lot of the people who are coming in now are not actually Mexican. They're from other countries coming through Mexico, but they are trying to get around the secure border, Mexico's southern border, which means they are taking more dangerous routes to get to the United States without being seen, which means they are at the mercy of possible gangs, drug cartels, and illegal police, well, not illegal, but corrupt police in Mexico, which is creating the more dangerous forms of entry into the country. And so, yeah. So the reality is Mexicans actually have been returning to Mexico because their economy is getting better, but there's still people coming through Mexico from other countries. And so when we see them coming through Mexico, our government says Mexicans are coming. But when you look at it, because I taught some of these students, some of them are from Guatemala and some of them are from El Salvador that came through Mexico. All right, moving right along. Question number 10. from Dr. Claude Anderson's book is this: what is racism, and can a black person be a racist? For those of you who are taking notes, and those of you who want to write some things on the screen, for those who will come back and scroll through, please feel free to do so. I'm going to read this fairly slowly so we can all get it. All right? Racism is a group-based power and economic control phenomenon in which one racial group owns and controls so much wealth and resource power that it can enslave, subordinate, exploit, exclude, or render another group non-competitive. Do y'all need me to repeat that? I'm going to repeat it, okay? One more time. So I want you to think about this in terms of, can black people be racist? Racism is a group-based power and economic control phenomenon in which one racial group, keyword, owns and controls. We're not talking about consumer spending power. What do you own? One racial group owns and controls so much wealth and resource power that it can enslave, subordinate, exploit, exclude, or render another group non-competitive. Until black people can do that, we are not racist. Okay? That's the simplest way to put it. The dominant racial group can make life and death decisions for potential competitor groups. It can predetermine what the lesser powered group can own, control, its wealth, and the extent to which it will be allowed to compete in a society. I don't see any black people doing that. All right? Racism is one of the most contentious and dangerous terms in the English lexicon, and it is overused and misapplied by laymen and scholars alike. In a society in which the policy of benign neglect is still operative against blacks, there has been an effort to equate and replace racism with classism. Class is defined by economic status, educational level, and employment status and professional accomplishment. Class is fluid. You can be high class today and you lose some of these things, and you can be considered low class when you lose stuff. All right? Blacks as a group cannot cross the color or race line. Religious, gender, ethnic, or cultural groups are not the victims of racism, but classism. The power and economic control phenomenon of racism is non-applicable to them because classes are subcategories of the larger society, and generally they participated in the economic enrichment from black enslavement. Further, classes are open and fluid and promote the right to compete for equality. Hence, why the immigrant can come here and they can move from, maybe in their society they were low class, but they can come here for opportunities such as we have just discussed in the previous book, and they can move into a higher class. All right? Racism came into existence on the eve of the Civil War after all the resources had been distributed to European whites. The practice of racism was originally designed to deny blacks the right to compete, to be equal, and to become a class. While racism is group-based, Class discrimination is individualized and arises from prevailing societal issues. For instance, when Arabs are profiled and connected to terrorism, it is discrimination, but it is not racism. When Hispanics are profiled and associated with illegal immigration, it is not racism, but discrimination arising out of contemporary social concerns. In neither of the recited instances is the purpose of the class discrimination to exploit, enslave, or segregate all members of the classes. It is inaccurate to equate class minorities to blacks and racism. History reveals that the concept of racism has undergone a metamorphosis in both meaning and application through the centuries. To understand racism and deal with it effectively, it is important to understand the historical origin and purpose of racism, to know what it is and what it is not. Racism as a word and concept did not just pop up out of the blue. It evolved from a confluence of events and circumstances. The practice of equating individualized gender, ethnic, cultural, and religious discrimination to institutionalized racism against black people provides justification for continuing the racial status quo. In the late 1400s, two essential factors came together from which racism evolved: the possibility of free land in the Americas and free labor from African blacks. At that time, the entire continent of Europe was dysfunctional, ravaged by famine, crime, poverty, and disease. All right? Those of you who are history buffs, you will remember that the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, all right, infested Europe in the 1300s, killing off an estimated, I think the number was between 20 to 75 million, no, 20 to 200 million people. So the estimate is pretty big, but they don't know exactly how many people died during the Black Plague. And that happened in the 1300s. So you have to realize Europe was coming out of a time of disease, crime, famine, poverty, and death. They were looking for lands to conquer, to infuse their nations with new energy and new wealth. The Catholic Church was the leading invader and controller of world expansionism at the time, which we read last week in Stamped from the Beginning. During that period, the Vatican was given, listen, during that period, the Vatican was given 16 black slaves as a gift. So all of my wonderful African friends who are going over to Italy, going to Rome, visiting the Vatican, you might want to ask them about those 16 black slaves that they received as a gift. A short time later, Pope Innocent, how ironic, issued a special edict and declared that blacks should be used as free labor, thereby establishing a new kind of slavery. Until that time, a person could be enslaved for only 3 reasons. All right? Religious persecution, for those of you taking notes. Personal indebtedness, also known as indentured servitude. So you were enslaved to pay off a debt, and then when you paid off the debt, you were free to go. Or for being a prisoner of war. All right? And we know that they also had, they were enslaving people under the religious persecution. But now, this Pope, Pope Innocent, as in innocence, okay, you can look him up and find Pope Innocent's edict that set the course for black people being used around the world as free labor, because it was sanctioned by the religious. What we got to repent for? I don't know. When Columbus returned to Europe with news that he had discovered a new discovered a new uninhabited land, which was a lie because there were inhabitants there, a vision took hold to merge available free black labor with new free land. So, as you can see, a lie took hold. All right? This creation of free black labor with the supposed free land seemed like a good match. At that precise point, racism replaced tribalism, the social structure of Europe at the time. 9 European nations went into competition. A politico-economic race commenced to see which country could best exploit free black labor and use it to capture land, resources, and wealth to enrich their countries. And if you go to the National Museum, if you've been there yet, exactly, Lady Ravonda says, now I'm starting to understand why people have a problem with the church. Bingo! All right? If you go to the National Museum, if you have an opportunity to go, especially this summer, I would encourage you to come. If you get in touch with us before you come, preferably at least a week or so before, we might be able to meet up with you and join you in that tour. All right? But if you go to the museum, you will see on the wall when you go to the lowest floor, which is supposed to, the museum is supposed to start, the basement starts with where we were and it goes upward to where we are now. That's how the museum is set up. I always encourage black people, if you are coming to the museum for the first time, I encourage you to start with where we are and go back down to where we've been. If you are not a black American, if you're not descended from slaves, I encourage you to start the other way. I encourage you to start where we come from and then go up to get the real gravity of what has happened to black Americans in this country. But if you go to the museum, you will see it has on one of the walls literally all of the countries that conspired together in selling us off. It has every country, it has their monies up there, and it has how much money each country was making off of the slave trade. And in today's terms, it will probably be billions of dollars that each country was making off of the slave trade. All right. So all of these countries were in a race to see how they could exploit free labor. All of them. All right. And the museum lists all of them. So when we talk about reparations, yeah, we can start with the United States, but the United States is not the only country that needs to recognize they owe. And when you start talking like that, people get upset because now you're talking about their mammon, you're talking about their money. We'll apologize all day long, but don't tell us to pay anything. That's where you lose people, all right? That economic race using free black labor lasted until the eve of 1861 Civil War in the US. The race between the European nations ended at this point because the resources and wealth of the Americas had been distributed, and nearly 100% of everything was now in the hands of white Europeans. At the same time, European slaveholders denied enslaved blacks the right to not only enjoy the fruit of their labor, but also the right to acquire land, wealth, and political power. These exclusions were instituted as law, and blacks were defined as powerless property. Go and read your Constitution. Just a reminder. We are an amendment in the U.S. Constitution. And guess what? Amendments can be nullified by new amendments. Anybody heard of prohibition? Prohibition was an amendment in the Constitution to outlaw alcohol. And then guess what? When they wanted to reinstitute alcohol as something legal, they wrote another amendment that nullified the previous one. So let me remind black people, descendants of the enslaved in this country, that we are an amendment. And so if you have not figured out what that means, I want you to go study your Constitution. And then I want you to go study what does it take to get a new amendment written and passed, because the current people in office are trying to call a constitutional convention so they can write up some more stuff. All right. I also want you to take a look at the Windrush generation over in Britain, who are now being kicked out of Britain and told to return to the Caribbean, to Jamaica, after they were invited over to Britain to build up Britain. And some of them have been there for 50 years. And now Britain wants them to get out and go home to, for many of them, their descendants, to a place they've never been to. All right. And so if we think that America is not capable of doing something like that, pay attention. Pay attention. So, European slaveholders denied enslaved blacks the right not only to enjoy the fruits of their labor, but also the right to acquire land, wealth, and political power. These exclusions were instituted as law, and blacks were defined as powerless property. The founding fathers rigged the race. They crafted a social construct that locked black people into a constitutional underclass status, and white society as a group remains opposed to corrective redistribution of wealth, power, and resources to black Americans. After all the resources had been distributed to whites by the 1860s, the concept of racism morphed from an economic issue to one of biology, with Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection presented in his 1859 book, Origin of the Species. In this book, he ranked living organisms and classified black people at the bottom of human species. So, while we're taking away your economics, we're now also indoctrinating society to believe that you are at the bottom rung of human species. This is all working in tandem. And by the way, for those of you who are spiritual, this is what we would call doctrines of devils. Okay? A doctrine is a teaching that develops and creates a stronghold in your society. And if you don't think that this is a stronghold, just turn on your television. All right? Out of Darwin's biological theories grew the requirement that all persons be identified by racial designations on their birth certificates, driver's licenses, and other public documents. Race remained a biological issue until a century later with the advent of the Black Civil Rights Movement, when racism morphed again. The concept of racism expanded and took on a more colloquial and casual meaning that signified not power, but personal feelings about liking or disliking individuals. This misdirection and misapplication of the term racism allowed the original objective of racism to maintain the inequality between white people and black people. In other words, someone disliking you, all right, is not necessarily racism, all right? As he states here, racism was a construct that was built into our society. So to reduce racism to simply whether or not somebody likes you or dislikes you actually deflects from actually solving the issue of real racism. Racism grew out of the competitive race between groups to control wealth and power and resources. As early as 1516 in North America, whites have been the winners and black people the losers, allowed only to react to racism. Blacks do not have the power or wealth as a collective. It is therefore not possible for them to be racist. Prejudiced? Yes. I've met a lot of prejudiced black people. Bigoted? Yes. I've met a lot of bigoted black people. But racism is about power, wealth, and control of resources and the ability of one group over another to control it. In case you didn't know, whites control about 90% of the wealth and resources in this country. 90-10. 90-10. Okay? That's the reality. Chapter 2, Origins of Racist Ideas. We're going to just start this today, and then we'll continue on next week. Richard Mather and John Cotton inherited from the English thinkers of their generation the old racist ideas that African slavery was natural and normal and holy. Remember what we just read. Pope Innocent added in that third piece for everybody, okay? Because he issued an edict that said that black people, specifically black people, could be used for free labor all over the world. So, these racist ideas were nearly 2 centuries old when the Puritans began to use them in the 1630s to legalize and codify New England slavery. And Virginians had done the same in the 1620s. Specifically, 1619 is the record of when the first free black labor stepped onto the shores. There were other Africans that came before that, but they didn't come as free black labor. So 1619 is actually, our government actually wrote a nice little edict. President Trump wrote a little nice edict acknowledging the 400-year mark of slavery come 2019 in America. Back in 1415, Prince Henry and his brothers had convinced their father, King John of Portugal, to capture the principal Muslim trading depot in the western Mediterranean, Ceuta, on the northeastern tip of Morocco. These brothers were envious of Muslim riches, and they sought to eliminate the Islamic middleman so that they could find the southern source of gold and black captives. After the battle, Moorish prisoners left Prince Henry spellbound as they detailed trans-Saharan trade routes down into the disintegrated Mali Empire. Since Muslims still controlled these desert routes, Prince Henry decided to, quote, seek the lands by the way of the sea. He sought out those African lands until his death in 1460, using his position as the Grand Master of Portugal's wealthy military order of Christ, also known as the successor to what would become the Knights Templar, to draw venture capital and loyal men for his African expeditions. In 1452, Prince Henry's nephew, King Alfonso V, commissioned Gomez Zurara to write a biography of the life and slave trading work of his beloved uncle. Zurara was a learned and obedient commander in Prince Henry's military order of Christ. In recording and celebrating Prince Henry's life, Zurara was also implicitly obscuring his Grand Master's monetary decision to exclusively trade in African slaves. In 1453, Zurara finished the inaugural defense of African slave trading, the first European book on Africans in the modern era. The Chronicle of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea begins the recorded history of anti-black racist ideas. Zarara's inaugural racist ideas, in other words, were a product of, not a producer of, Prince Henry's racist policies concerning African slave trading. The Portuguese made history as the first Europeans to sail along the Atlantic beyond the western Sahara's Cape Bojador in order to bring enslaved Africans back to Europe. As Zarara shared in his book, the six caravels carrying 240 captives arrived in Lagos, Portugal, on August 6, 1444. Prince Henry made the slave auction into a spectacle to show the Portuguese, who had joined the European League of Serious Slave Traders of African people. For some time, the Genoese of Italy, the Catalans of northern Spain, and the Valencians of eastern Spain had been raiding the Canary Islands or purchasing African slaves from Moroccan traders. Zorara distinguished the Portuguese by framing their African slave trading ventures as missionary expeditions. Prince Henry's competitors could not play that mind game as effectively as he did, in all likelihood because they still traded so many Eastern Europeans. But the market was changing. Around the time the Portuguese opened their sea route to a new slave port area, the old slave export area started to close up. In Ibn Khaldun's day, most of the captives sold in Western Europe were Eastern Europeans who had been seized by Turkish raiders from areas around the Black Sea. So many of the seized captives were Slavs that the ethnic term became the root word for slave in most Western European languages. By the mid 1400s, Slavic communities had built forts against slave raiders, causing the supply of Slavs in Western Europe's slave market to plunge at around the same time that the supply of Africans began to increase. As a result, Western Europeans began to see the natural Slav or slave not as a white European, but black. You want to know where your term slave comes from? It comes from the fact that Europeans were initially trading Europeans. But guess what? When you realize that all over the world are these black people that you might never run out of because there's plenty of them all over the world, it becomes a more lucrative business for you to classify and define slavery and define free labor as black. Just say law on that. All right? This has been another episode of Daring Dialogues, and I have been your host today. I want to thank you for your time and attention. Again, we will be back tonight to cover our motivation piece that we did not cover on yesterday. So if you want to get in on tonight's talk, it's going to be happening at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank you today for your time and attention. Remember, light is the most daring opposition to darkness. And part of light, what does light do? Light exposes. Light makes things clear. Light brings a level of transparency. So that's what we're trying to do here. All right? And we encourage you to do the same thing. Thank you, Kenyatta, for that. I appreciate you saying that. That's what we want to encourage you to do. Be light wherever you are. It is so much disinformation, misinformation out there. That's why I encourage people, don't just take a meme, okay, at face value. Don't even just take a newspaper article at face value. Pick up a book and read. Read what the scholars are telling you. Read what they have written. People who have documented sources, their sources have sources. You can go back. some of the books that are listed in what we're reading. You can go back and find those actual books for what's called your source information, right? So we want to make sure that we're not just scrolling down our time feeds, right? We're not just scrolling down our timelines and just taking in information and automatically believing it to be so, but we want to make sure that what we're reading we can actually find a source for what we're reading. So I want to thank you again for your time and attention. Go out today, be light, help somebody, be kind, be courteous. Somebody definitely in the world and society in which we live, somebody needs help today. Ask God to point you in the direction of somebody who can use your help, who can use your wisdom, who can use your resources, whatever you have. Try to be light today. Try to be light. There's enough darkness going around. There's enough people who want to have wars and riots and all of that. Try to be the opposite. Try to be peace for somebody today. Try to be an encouraging word for someone today. All right. So for those of you who can make it back, I will see you at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Take care and God bless.